All right, everyone. Nice to see you, or the other way around, hopefully. Well, this has been quite an odyssey. We've gone to a couple of 2 or 3 different classrooms now. I was very excited when we got into Buchanan in 2010. That's a very comfortable room, good tech and everything. And then along comes COVID. So, as my email said, this week, right now, just plan on asynchronous lecture and meeting in person for your discussion sections, unless the TA tells you otherwise. Exam tomorrow. So it will be a very simple exam, I would say. It'll be 20 questions, like I said, multiple choice. I originally intended it to be longer, but, well, getting sick, and I wasn't able to cover the things I had hoped to, not everything I'd hoped to. So there will be 20 concepts, definitions, kind of key ones that maybe a couple from each lecture, a couple from each reading, that kind of thing. You'll have 50 minutes to complete it. It'll be through Gaucho Space. We'll open up tomorrow morning and stay open until 11:59 p.m. There will be class tomorrow, and then I'll have a lecture uploaded on Wednesday and probably Thursday as well. We'll see if maybe I'll get well enough to come back on Thursday, but I don't know if that would be worth the risk mainly to you. So anyway, feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. I'll be sort of in and out, but as I said, everything on the exam is on the study guide. And obviously not everything on the study guide is on the exam, but I don't think it should be too hard, especially since it will be open note and open book and just very lenient for this exam. Maybe the next one will be a little bit different. I am feeling better for the most part. My throat still really hurts, and I don't know if I'm still contagious or not yet. So anyway. I'll just lecture here for the moment. Okay. Today we cover urbanization and the environment. Start with the environment, then move to urbanization. In a lot of textbooks, sociology textbooks, you'll see that urbanization and the environment are often the last chapters of the textbook. Same with population. And I've always thought that's sort of a backward way to do it. I kind of like having, for the most part, a broader outlook toward the beginning of the class, and then sort of narrow in on things like the economy and gender and race and health and all of these different things. But I think it helps to understand population. I hope you watched the population lecture that was from a class I taught at Penn State a year ago, but it will do since I had COVID. It wasn't well enough to lecture. Okay, anyway, I'm going to stop rambling and just let you know that I will be going over I'll be posting the instructions for the rough draft of the paper and what you'll be expected for that. I'll be posting that tomorrow. So anyway, I'll be engaging on Packback, and hopefully we'll be able to reconvene in the lecture hall next week. Cross our fingers. Okay. As I said, environmental sociology, this is kind of one of my main fields. I also teach in the environmental studies program. I reviewed a few of the chapters in this book that really opened my eyes to the growth of factory farming in North Carolina, for example. And a couple years later, there was major flooding, and in the flood were contaminated water from these huge factory farms. Anyway, both very good introductions to the subfield of environmental sociology, which has grown. The American Sociological Association meetings have gone from small, pretty small groups studying climate change. Everybody knows each other and that kind of thing, to slowly bigger and bigger rooms, and pretty much most fields now in sociology deal with climate change or the environment in one way or another. Personal background in this area: when I was a graduate student for a while, I was the managing editor of the Journal of Environment and Development. Not the best picture of it there. And we would get studies from around the world and have to decide on whether or not we wanted to publish them. I also turned my dissertation into a book, Smart Growth Entrepreneurs, Partners in Urban Sustainability, which is priced pretty high, mainly for, I guess, university libraries and development firms and that kind of thing. But anyway, it's a look at, kind of a sociological look at how does sustainable urban development happen, meaning relatively high density but high quality, as well as affordability. And it is quite a puzzle. It's a puzzle. I was focused on California and the suburbs around Portland, Oregon. And it's a puzzle that, a lot of people are trying to put together. And I didn't even really go into water, for example, in great detail, other than some, just mentioning it a few times. But anyway, so I'm very interested in the sort of interface of urbanism and the environment. I also just, want to, don't know if his name comes up here, but kind of recognize the sort of movement that's happening within, say, conservative political circles, a movement to adopt, sort of environmental values, but having a different approach than, say, people on the left, seeing the responsibility to lie with individuals and community groups and religious organizations, things like that. So the late British conservative scholar Roger Scruton, sorry, I don't have that, it's cutting off right there, Roger Scruton, wrote a book that I found intriguing and thought-provoking called How to Think Seriously About the Planet, The Case for an Environmental Conservatism. And on its focus on sort of decentralized communities and stuff, it's actually similar to a lot of kind of far left ideas about the environment too, that don't necessarily want the approaches to be dictated by, say, the state and economic actors. So inevitably, when we talk about the environment, it's hard to be optimistic. And I think I may have mentioned earlier in this class, maybe it was the environmental studies class, but when I was at UCSB as a graduate student 10 years ago, I felt that inevitably societies were going to have some tough times ahead on a social level, but also with climate change. And I think coming back here now, it's kind of interesting to compare. I'm a bit more dour now about it. I think the challenge will be greater, and it will be more urgent, and there will be a lot more, I think, potential for chaos than we may have been prepared for. A lot of things that we didn't expect happening until, say, like the 2040s, both in terms of the environment, but also in terms of, say, politics. Politics of ethnicity really taking off, probably accelerated in time by social media. So anyway, it's very easy to, I think, become very pessimistic. But at the same time, there's also still a lot of opportunity, a lot of opportunities for creative minds to do things, and that's essentially what we're here for in college. So anyway, I think the best way to go about it is to be an apocalyptimist, which is not necessarily a real category, but it's on a meme. So someone who knows it's all going to shit, but still thinks it will turn out okay. So we are in this era, the Anthropocene, a lot of debate about this. Anthropocene, meaning a specific new, almost geologic time, time period on Earth, but it's kind of caused and directed or something by one species, humans. And there's a lot of debate about whether it's a good concept for scientific use, or for activist use. I mean, it's probably good. It's good for activism in the sense that it really kind of makes it clear that we're changing basically all systems on Earth. Now, in terms of a sort of a geologic one, scientific, I'll let the natural scientists work on that one. But regardless, we are causing immense changes by growing different types of plants around the world that become food for people in different parts of the world, with consequences such as what we're seeing with Russia, Ukraine, the wheat harvest, and the countries that are facing starvation and famine if they don't get it. We're seeing a lot of advances in genetics. There's understanding new ways in which to grow food, etc., etc. So it's an exciting time in terms of science, but definitely a challenging time. This was a few years ago, right before COVID really hit the world. Australia had some of the worst fires that they had ever had in history, to the point that a lot of koala habitat is gone. Hopefully they can rehabilitate them, but there's, arguments to be made that they're close to being functionally extinct if they're not already. What does functionally extinct mean? It means that they're extinct without the help or care of humans. That left on their own, they may just die off in the next fire or famine or something like this. And a lot of other species die. It's estimated that something like 1 billion or more, or almost 3 billion, I said. So huge disasters. And this was right before COVID hit. And then COVID hits, and well, I think that has just made everything even more complicated. The world's inability to work together in some ways was discouraging. At the same time, the world's ways in which we did work together, especially scientists and the vaccines, that is cause for hope. So it's not all doom and gloom. So environmental sociology, we look at the interactions between the physical environment and our social organization. Interesting figure who recently passed away just a few weeks ago, but who's kind of revolutionized how we see the world, or many of us. A guy named James Lovelock. He was a British engineer, and he was actually working for NASA at the time and looking at satellite images of Mars and kind of comparing them with the Earth. And he came up with this idea of Earth as this sort of almost living being, not literally, but compared to Mars, it appeared to be this living being. And someone suggested he call it Gaia, from ancient Greek mythology, meaning essentially Mother Earth. And so he did. He's kind of popularized that notion. So if you've heard Gaia in reference to Earth or something natural or whatever, I think there's a product, Gaia, now. This comes from him, and he's written a number of books looking at these things. So he just died at age 102. So he has seen a lot in his time. He's written a lot of books about it. One quick aside, but now it's moved on past me. But anyway, he became sort of pessimistic in his later years about humans' ability by which to fix ourselves, to right our course of direction. And his last book was was Novacene, the coming age of hyperintelligence. And here he says, well, maybe the systems that we are developing now will outlive us, and they'll figure out ways in which to stabilize the planet. And he makes the point, we're not the end point of human evolution. If you've seen the movie, sorry, it's cutting off down here, but Artificial Intelligence by Steven Spielberg, there's sort of a scene towards the end that's kind of similar to what Lovelock was describing. But again, his point being that humans, we've accomplished a lot, but we're tied to energy. Our population growth is tied to supplies of energy. So we may not be the end point, is what he is saying, because many species are going extinct quite rapidly. And just to go through a quick survey and sort of kind of give you an awareness of the issue. We know that there's been about 5 mass extinctions in the past, and we are certainly going through a 6th mass extinction. And what is different about what's different about this one is that it's happening more rapidly than we think many of the others have happened, and it's one species that is really causing it, anthropogenic action, essentially. And you can start to see where it happens, with mammals and birds and vertebrates going extinct in the 1600s, and then other vertebrates more recently. And we see in most of the world we've seen huge declines in biodiversity. Some places we've seen increases. That's partly lack of development in those places. Excuse me, and sometimes it's species moving into those areas, but for the most part we're seeing, where, and I should say, in some of those places there's not a lot of life to begin with, but where we do see a lot of life, we're seeing a lot of it disappear. In the United States, the bird populations have fallen dramatically. When I was younger, one of my first jobs that I wanted to have was to be an ornithologist, to study birds, because I thought they were very fascinating and that they flew. So you see, eastern birds fallen by 17%, grassland birds in much of, say, the plains regions in the middle of the country, huge declines, over half of those, and we know that shorebirds have fallen, in huge numbers as well. I think the time scale is really astounding. Going back 1970, the population of breeding adult birds in the United States and Canada goes from about 10 billion down to about 7 billion. Maybe we're down below 7 billion now, so almost 3 billion birds gone in 50 years, and 50 years is not very long at all. Now, I am a cat lover. I have a tattoo, a cat tattoo. My cat teaching assistant isn't here right now, but anyway, but we don't let our cats out, and one reason, other than them picking up diseases and things like that, the traffic and so on, is because cats, they still have their killer instinct. Even if they get fed canned food at home, they still want to go out and kill things. And so they've been actually decimating bird populations around the country. So again, as I said, we're looking at huge changes, and kind of there's a bit of a focus on Australia because they're just a very dry place to begin with. Not a lot of places that people can live, or some of these other very unique animals. So sociologists have been looking at it in different ways. One theoretical approach is called the treadmill of production, developed by a guy named Alan Schneiberg. David Pello has written in this field, this area. He's also in the environmental studies program here at UCSB. Great guy if you ever get a chance to talk to him or take a class from him. So the treadmill of production basically says that, focusing on capitalism, but saying, this applies to, industrial communism as well, that really modernism requires just the constant extraction of resources, constant destruction of ecosystems, and pollution. And, you would need a complete transformation of society. Just improvements in efficiency and so long that only prolongs the inevitable crash. Another environmental sociologist named Richard York at the University of Oregon came and gave a talk here a number of years ago, but in his research at the time at least, he found that it was depressing or disheartening. He found that, renewable energy didn't really replace fossil fuel use. It just added to overall usage of energy. So he's looking, I think, nationally at the United States and maybe a couple of other countries, looking to see, okay, they add on various amounts of green energy. Does that bring down oil or coal use and things like that? No, it just meant that there was more energy to use, more lights to turn on, and, cheaper energy, that kind of thing. So that's, again, sort of an argument in favor of the treadmill of production. The treadmill of production is in many ways a very pessimistic theory. Alan Schneiberg himself committed suicide in 2009, I believe, maybe 2010. So anyway, basically there's an approach, it's not really in sociology, but kind of philosophy, and I think some sociologists may be into it, called neo-primitivism, that basically says we spent most of our lives, in primitive conditions, and so we should, expect, to be in that sort of situation more than, like a Star Trek sort of future, something like this. So that's one way in which to look at it, or one possible approach. The other major approach that also comes out of sociology, but I think in many ways these two kind of approaches really define excuse me, the ways forward, or the ways in which we have to kind of look at them. Probably a middle ground, I'm sure. But that's ecological modernization. I'll just call it ecological modernism or eco-modernism. Developed by a number of Dutch sociologists going back to the 1980s. And it's been actually very influential in European environmental policies, for example. So what they argue is that there needs to be a mix of markets, of innovation, entrepreneurialism, competition, who can, make the cleanest energy source, that kind of thing, along with targeted governmental regulations. Not necessarily going after entire industries, but maybe certain parts of industries that pollute more than others, that sort of thing. Technology isn't seen as just prolonging the inevitable. It's seen as our best hope, and that it's too late to turn back on industrial civilization. Primitivism or neo-primitivism. Nobody wants to fall back into sort of that chaotic state or something like that. So eco-modernists say technology, that's basically that's the best thing that we can do. One example of eco-modernism that's pretty extreme is what's called de-extinction, which is basically using DNA that we have from species that have gone extinct to bring back those species. It's actually already been done. The Bucaro mountain goat went extinct in 2003 in northern Spain. They brought one back a number of years ago. It lived for 20 minutes or something like that, but I think they've had some more success since then. They're looking at rhinos and frogs, and there's a lot of ethical debate about this. There's some who want to bring back the woolly mammoth in Russia to help in the tundra, bring back some of the grasslands to what it was during that time, which was more natural and was better for the tundra and actually would reduce global warming in strange ways. And then there's more, I think, reasonable approaches, which are saying, bring back this Bacaro goat that lived in the mountains in northern Spain, would not be too disruptive, as long as they were, protected and stuff like that. Again, it's less a matter of science now and more of a matter of the sort of morals and sort of who would regulate it, government regulation, that kind of thing. So, something that you may see a poll, you will see a poll on PackBack, kind of, asking you if you had to choose which of these, which do you lean toward more? So there are, again, a lot of ways in which the environment is challenged, facing challenge. One is our food system. Now, we live at a time in which people are eating more food at cheaper prices than, almost any time in history. Food prices obviously have gone up in the last, few months and last year or so, but generally speaking, we've had tremendously low prices for food. It's come at great cost, I think, environmentally, certainly, but also I think ethically and morally. The factory farm system is something that's in many ways kind of gone out of control. There's a good movie about this called Okja, made by Bong Joon-ho, who also directed Parasite, which won the Academy Award a few years ago. And he, by the way, was also a major in sociology, which explains why his films are the way they are. But Okja is about this super pig that has an attachment to this girl, but there's this factory farm that wants it, and so on. When we look at the factory farms, just some numbers here, as you can see, 50 million penguins in the world, 20 billion chickens. In 1980, 2 billion wild birds in Europe, now 1.6 billion. Meanwhile, there are 1.9 billion chickens more than there were back then. The 9 out of 10 large animals are either humans or have been domesticated. So, back a few years ago, there was some skepticism about global warming because the atmospheric temperatures weren't spiking like people expected, as with the amount of fossil fuel, and it was called the climate pause. And some people were saying, "See, that's global warming. It's taken care of. It's not as bad as we think it is." But then there were a number of studies that were looking at the oceans, and they all basically found that the warming was going to the ocean. So the vast majority of global warming now is happening in the ocean, and that can lead to some dire consequences. That means that the glaciers will be melting much more quickly. It also means that there will be much more chaotic, violent storms along coastlines. It'll happen here in California, maybe not, now or the next decade or so, but eventually. But it will happen much, much sooner to, Central America, the southern states of the United States, the Bahamas, the South Pacific Islands and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's where a lot of the warming has went. I had the pleasure of experiencing some of the polar vortexes when I was in Pennsylvania. And so that's happening because as the warming increases at the North Pole, kind of pushes down these, these huge areas of very, very cold weather, very cold storm, these polar vortex storms. They're very dangerous. So beyond the clear environmental damage and documenting it, what exactly are environmental sociologists contributing? Besides the treadmill of production and the eco-modernism, there's another approach just in terms of how to view everything. And I think once you look at this and understand this, you'll see this everywhere. Disproportionality. Bill Freudenberg was an environmental sociologist at UCSB, one of the founders of environmental sociology, passed away a number of years ago. But basically, in decades of research, he found that actually most environmental harm isn't caused by just one industry, but rather a few either criminal or negligent companies or even just facilities. Sometimes, like I said, criminal, sometimes just negligent, kind of ignorant, that kind of thing. And he began to challenge some of the ideas that have been prevalent in the environmental movement, which are, for a long time, were a focus just on, things the individual can do, recycling and using less and that sort of thing, which all, of course, are all very important. But it misses where a lot of the problem is. So the sort of individual focus in environmentalism is problematic, for one, because sometimes it makes problems seem bigger and harder to solve. When you just talk about sometimes it can seem like, we're just not able to change anything without, suffering our way of life. And certainly there's a lot of truth in that, but there's also, there's also a number of ways in which we can make changes that will actually reduce pollution without necessarily revolutionizing everything. So again, this also can lead to environmental elitism, which, in Santa Barbara, there's a lot of that going on, where, like I drive a Prius or a Tesla or whatever it is, and, all of these other people are, driving their polluting cars and so on. It also misses that, it basically misses that we can identify a lot of the problems at a much more precise level. So while it's good to know, how much on average Americans are using, the devil is in the details, so to speak. So there's the individual focus, and then there's also the organized producers. In my environmental studies class, the students take an eco-footprint quiz where, they can look at their, how much resources they use and that kind of thing. And then, it's usually used to kind of wake people up to, their way of life. But I have them go a step further and say, okay, say your biggest contribution is, your automobile. Well, who supplies, the oil you need for your automobile to run? So basically then they look at the organized producer that supplies them with the things that they have, the things that they can make choices on. And as an individual, you're fairly limited, especially when it comes to, driving a nice fuel-efficient car, for example. An electric car, all of these things are very expensive for a lot of people right now. So a lot of the pollution is actually done not even in, say, the waste process, but in the production process itself. Forget the guy's name, but he did a huge analysis. It's maybe 10 or 20 years old now, but found that, something like 90% of the waste in the world is, during the production process. It's before the product even reaches the shelves or the boxes in Amazon or whatever, So anyway, the focus should be these organized producers. And I think here's a fantastic example of this concept. Sorry. Okay, so there are 6,000 power plants in the United States. Turns out that 30% of all power sector carbon dioxide emissions recently came from the 50 dirtiest power plants. 30%. That's a big number coming from the 50 dirtiest. 50% of the carbon dioxide emissions came from the 100 dirtiest plants. Then 90%, almost all of it, came from the 500 dirtiest plants. That means that there are 5,500 facilities that are responsible for only 10% of the carbon dioxide emissions. So again, this is applying the disproportionality approach. And other environmental sociologists and scientists have done this and are doing this now. So the point here then is, okay, maybe rather than passing some huge regulation that applies to every power plant or something, we could look at, okay, well, what about these 50 dirtiest power plants that are responsible for 30%? If we reduce those, we can knock out 30% of the carbon dioxide emissions, or 20% or 25%, maybe not all of it, or the 50%, or maybe we'll look at this 500 plants. And so some people have done that, and sometimes, again, it's a couple of things. Sometimes it's just a function of size. If you have a power plant that powers Los Angeles, it's going to be bigger and pollute more than a power plant that powers Goleta, something like that. Things like that. But in many other cases too, they found it was criminal negligence. Other times, just sort of inefficiency, and when the companies were sort of notified about this, they actually changed their practices, and actually their profits grew because they became more efficient. So anyway, I think disproportionality, once you see it here, you see it all over, especially when it comes to environmental stuff, but then you also see it everywhere else in society. Nassim Taleb, a libertarian philosopher, also has a similar approach. He focuses on asymmetry, but it's kind of similar sort of idea. Another example of this disproportionality: 50% of toxins come from less than 4% of facilities, of individual facilities, power plants, or in this case, chemical production plants. Now, what's crucial here is that he did a lot of research, Freudenberg and some of these other environmental sociologists, and they found that basically, the rest of these facilities across the country can produce the same chemicals with significantly less pollution. So, some of these companies were just taking advantage of lax environmental laws or breaking laws, that kind of thing. Another example, in the early 2000s, a study was done that found that 5% of total vehicles accounted for 43% of emissions. So, again, you can, rather than wait for everyone to, afford a Tesla or, something like this, maybe find, okay, what are these 5% of vehicles? Or maybe we can target regulations there, reduce emissions without necessarily having to ramp up production of a completely new technology and so on. Other area where sociologists have contributed to the study of the environment is the study of environmental racism. So This began back in the 1980s. A guy named Robert Bullard, who was from Iowa, and I'm from Nebraska. And one time I met, very influential, very profound meeting. We talked about the Midwest anyway. He wrote a book called Dumping in Dixie, and he was looking at, he seemed to find this disproportionality, didn't call it that at the time, but between where the waste was, where industrial sites were, and minority neighborhoods, and specifically he was looking at black neighborhoods in the South, in the South. And so he kind of sparked this, this wave of research on the area, on that area, meaning the area of race and the environment. So then people ask, okay, well, are companies locating, say, waste incinerators and industrial facilities in neighborhoods that happen to be poor, that just happen to be people of color there, because of the low property values? And that's a very legitimate suggestion. Land property is a big expense for companies, so that started this sort of battle, this sort of statistician battle within sociology. I forget who. There were these two researchers. One of them was last name Anderton with a T. The last name Anderson with an S, and I don't remember which one was which. But anyway, they were saying basically, well, it's the property values, that kind of thing. It's poverty. A guy named Paul Mohai was saying, no, it's race. And again, they were doing, looking at numbers and so on. And at some point in the early 2000s, somebody called Anderton and asked, so this environmental racism, do you think it's a real thing, or is it just the low property values, poverty, that kind of thing? And he said, well, that's what I used to think, but you should talk to Paul Mohai. He's got the best data on this. So that was basically him sort of conceding the argument, and basically went on to do that. And it turned out, yes, that actually industry has been found to locate in neighborhoods of color, even when there were much poorer white neighborhoods, neighborhoods of white poverty that they could have located in. They located in, say, a middle-class black neighborhood. And again, this was huge studies that were done on this. A student, former UCSB alumni, Mary Collins, did a huge study on this, one of the biggest studies. We found lots of disproportionality basically within industries, across industries, and then looked at environmental racism, found that too. She had like 4 or 5 MIT computer scientists working for her, crashed their computers. She was proud of that, but luckily they had the data still, and were able to do it. But anyway, fascinating study. Mary Collins, if you're interested. She was also Bill Freundberg's last PhD student. Okay, environmental justice becomes the movement that you have probably maybe heard of. It looks at basically this inequality that happens with people who are poor, but also people of color, who are just generally people who are disadvantaged, not just in the U.S., but across the world. And this is another example of disproportionality. This is from 1990, so right when sort of this research began. But it's so good because it so clearly shows, what was going on, and in many cases, in many places, what's still going on. So this is Los Angeles. And you have the percentage of people of color. Yellow is 0 to 40. Red is 80 to 100%. And then the green dots are toxic release facilities, so, polluting places. And you can see clearly, that the toxic facilities generally tend to be where, you have high concentrations of people of color. Very interesting, I think, in Los Angeles County. really, I think, really just displays it very well. Again, in the very white neighborhoods, you don't see the toxic release facilities. And you can look in other places, just looking around the capital of Pennsylvania. I just moved from Pennsylvania, so maybe I'll look at Sacramento next time. So anyway, though, you can see once again how far people are from a waste incinerator, and the percentage are closer. So when you get further away, just members of the county, 77% of white people, are further away from it. I may have tied that in knots anyway. Sorry, COVID brain going on. Okay, so now again, it is, I think, Paul Mohai. Now, when we look at environmental justice research, there's been changes, and the world's progressed and so on, and changed in many ways, and now we're getting much better data, and able to look at both income and race, and do some very very interesting analyses of major metropolitan areas. Again, this is in Washington D.C., which in my view should be a state, but isn't. They are taxed without being represented. I think that is just the taxation without representation. I think that is the great irony of the American government's refusal to allow Washington D.C. to be a state, even though they are still taxed. They should at least drop the taxes on them, make it a tax-free place or something. Anyway, it's a gripe I've had for many years, even though I never lived there. So you can see these various polluting places, and the darker areas tend to be where you have greater concentrations of black people. Again, you got the lower concentrations here. Many don't see those major waste incinerating sites. So David Pello and Lisa Park, they did a study. They're both here at UCSB. Lisa, I think she's in the Asian Studies program. David Pello's in Environmental Studies. They did a study of Aspen, which is sort of the Santa Barbara of the Rocky Mountains. Major resort, lots of wealthy people there, a lot of people vacation there, that kind of thing. And they interviewed a number of people and looked at newspapers and all these various different things. A lot of the wealthy residents there, like in, say, Santa Barbara or Montecito, fly around the world, or they own large homes. They drive SUVs, have swimming pools and heated, they have a lot of heating, that sort of thing, because it's, up in the mountains. But a lot of them believed that the biggest environmental threats came from essentially their workforce, the service industry. The Latino workforce that lived, some lived in Aspen, but a lot of it lived, kind of on the edges of Aspen, kind of like in Santa Barbara. A lot of workers can't afford to actually live in Santa Barbara, so they have to drive in. Something like 50% or more of first responders even in Santa Barbara. So anyway, the Latino workforce, Pello and Park went to, kind of check out where they lived, and a lot of them lived in these trailer parks or these small motels, their carbon footprint is just tiny, compared to these wealthy environmentalists who, don't necessarily walk the walk. Anyway, very, very interesting kind of story of environmental justice. I think, in the context of Santa Barbara, and, if you're from sort of wealthy parts of California or on the edges, I think it's, kind of speaks to some of that experience. Just kind of general books about the environment before I kind of start talking about urbanization. Kind of making up for a lecture, so this will go on a little bit longer than an hour as usual. But David Wallace Wells basically saying, we have to look. We have to start preparing for the worst case scenarios, and that's going to be a big challenge. And I don't think the way in which these issues are talked about are adequate. We have to really kind of become more nuanced in our thinking. Collapse, if you remember Jared Diamond from the Guns, Germs, and Steel. He also wrote a book a number of years ago called Collapse, where he looked at a number of places, societies that had collapsed over time. He also looked at places that are under threat, like Australia, California, and so on. Excuse me. Well, I do a lot of urban sociology. I don't know which I'm more of, in urban or environmental sociology. Maybe environment. But I also study race and authoritarianism, politics, and stuff like that too. But I'm teaching urban sociology. I'll be doing this, using this book this fall, in case you're able to and interested. So, urban sociology, I think, one of the best ways to see where we are, where urban areas are, is to look at the world at night, and where the lights are. Now, obviously, there are plenty of people in places where there aren't lights, but a lot of the industrial civilization, cities and so on, are where a lot of the lights are. Now, I just think it's kind of fascinating right here. The Korean Peninsula, here you've got Japan and China, and that's South Korea there, and it looks like it's an island, but actually that's North Korea. But, North Korea just doesn't have much power, so at night, they've just got a very, very few lights on. Really kind of astonishing. Well, going back to kind of, the birth period of sociology, the Industrial Revolution, remember, people are pushed off their land and start moving into the cities, and the cities become these pretty overcrowded, dirty places, but they become these places where, sociology sort of emerges. In many ways, sociology is kind of like an anthropology of of industrial societies, and I have many anthropologist friends who would be upset with me saying that, but I don't care because I'm right and they're not. So anyway, one of the, I think, most consequential inventions of all time is the flushing toilet, the piped flushing toilet. Because it leads to, it leads to sanitation, a type of sanitation, that people could only dream of beforehand, and that many people in the world can still dream of. There's, a billion or two people that still, lack access to good toilets. So at this time also you start to see the beginnings of epidemiology. There was a sanitary survey that was done in London in the 1800s, and they were trying to basically figure out where this outbreak of cholera was coming from. And they essentially, looked at where people were getting sick and so on, and traced it back to this, this cesspool, where some people were getting water. And so you have that happening at the same time as the invention of this, toilet, which is all the rage. Everybody wanted one, because it, improves health. It also just frees up time, from having to figure out what to do with human waste and that kind of thing. So anyway, I think it's one of the greatest inventions, if not the greatest invention ever. Now, one of the things that we see, and it will be interesting to see where this goes, say, a century from now, is the global cities. Saskia Sassen, a sociologist, started noticing in the 1990s that there were cities that in some ways were being pulled out of their own nations into this sort of global network. London, Istanbul, but also Tokyo, New York City, Sao Paulo, places where there were major financial centers. And, there were in some ways the elites in these cities had more in common with each other than with, say, some of their own country folk. And, they'd argue that today. And in fact, today it's sort of, they would be called globalists by some people in a sort of pejorative fashion, versus nationalists or something for people who are more tied into their nation state. But these global cities have sort of an influence that goes beyond, excuse me, ouch, my throat's hurting. They have an influence that goes beyond their own country as centers of finance. They're, historically been places of trade, different cultures coming together, that kind of thing. I would say one of the changes here are that we could add tech centers too. So San Francisco, Seattle, definitely, Seoul, Beijing. I mean, there's so many places where you have major tech companies located, the tech infrastructure. That they are kind of a new sort of global city, in a way. In the sense that, again, you have sort of elites, and they're, starting to have more in common with each other than others. And in some places like Silicon Valley, dreaming of, breaking away into some neo-feudal society, as you've been reading about in this class. So, anyway, I said all this. I'm going to move past it. So we are seeing the megalopolis, huge cities. The largest city on Earth is, if you put Tokyo and Yokohama, essentially you see it as one city. It's 36 million people, I think. Essentially all of California into one crammed city. Really astounding what human density, what we're capable of. So there are also urban conurbations where you have sort of an unbroken, set of cities and towns and so on. It feels like you're driving through an urban area. So basically, as you get to maybe Thousand Oaks or so, and until you get to, well, I'll just say as a personal story, the first time I drove to San Diego from Los Angeles or from Santa Barbara was at night, and basically the whole way, on the 405, it feels like you're driving through a city, through one big, one big urban area. And then all of a sudden, it was dark, and it was dark for a long time, and I was just like, wow, this is weird. They obviously managed to stave off development here. What state park could this be that I'm not aware of? And, then I realized, of course, that was Camp Pendleton, the Navy base. So if you drive from, say, Washington, D.C. up to Boston, too, it's essentially driving through one big urban area. So anyway, this is all very... It's all very new, and it's all very dependent upon cheap energy. So again, just keep that in mind. So by looking at urban sociology, I've spent a lot of time thinking and studying urban planning. In the ways then that it's changed, and how it's segregated groups at times, and at times it's done good things. One of the most consequential people for modern cities, a guy named Robert Moses. He planned a lot of New York's freeway system and a lot of New York cities. He kind of was pretty kind of overly zealous about it, and was kind of not really asking for any community input, just kind of, bulldozing through neighborhoods, almost literally. He wanted to turn Central Park into this big parking lot, essentially, demolish a lot of Greenwich Village and, these kind of old neighborhoods in New York City and turn them into gigantic highways and so on. And then he was challenged by a woman named Jane Jacobs, who wrote this book, The Death and Life of American Cities. Highly recommend reading it if you're interested in cities and so on. So she fought this development. She was in Greenwich Village. She argued for higher densities and mixed-use buildings of commercial and residential spaces, at least in some areas of the city, like downtowns and kind of little pockets of town and so on. That way you would have a lot of activity happening, kind of 24-hour activity, and that would bring together people and community and that sort of thing. More pedestrian orientation. She was worried about the cities being built for the automobile. Los Angeles. So yeah, Los Angeles is it's a tragedy in some ways. I mean, it's a great city and I love all of it. Well, at certain times of the day, but anyway, it also shows a missed opportunity. You have some of the greatest weather in the nation that would be perfect for buses and trolleys and all of these things, but there was the automobile industry that came in and a lot of essentially conspiracy that destroyed the red bus system in Los Angeles. Los Angeles did have an innovative public transit system for a little while, and then it sort of fell apart. And now, we have the traffic problems there that we have, and the automobile dependency there. Again, in a place where the weather is very, very amenable to walking and public transit. So anyway, that will be a challenge for people to try to figure out in the coming years or decades. So Jacobs, eventually, won her battles against Moses, stopped them from destroying Central Park and Greenwich Village and so on. And now she's kind of a cultural superhero in different ways to different people. So to libertarians who are opposed to, government intervention in the economy, they like that she was generally opposed to most government intervention in the economy. She was pretty libertarian. But urban planners now also liked her because she had a lot of ideas for, designing cities for people rather than, automobiles, and that's kind of important now. So yeah, she was, as I said, kind of popular across different fields. Now, there's also a long history of racial segregation happening. I'll talk more about this when we talk about race specifically, but just briefly, just saying, that there were ways in which, basically zoning laws were written to keep investment out of black neighborhoods, because the powers that were at the time didn't want to see black people do well, advance. It built upon itself, and as you started to see a more segregated city and people not interacting, people's perceptions of each other became based more and more upon stereotypes. And then you throw in television and the sort of sensationalization of crime and violence and that kind of thing, and showing black people in that light, and then white people living in nice suburbs and so on. One of the things that is important to understand, I'll go into this in more detail, but just briefly, a lot of black people were not given loans to move to the suburbs back in the 1950s. So that set in motion a whole range of things, but we'll talk about that when we talk about race specifically, because it's a big part of it that isn't always discussed. So the government in the 1950s and 60s starts this program of urban renewal. Some of it is very good and necessary, taking buildings that were kind of decrepit and falling apart and fixing them up and stuff, and turning them into, say, apartments and so on. But for the most part, urban renewal is just this basic process of, either destroying old neighborhoods and building new, or, renovation. Now, and keep this in mind for the exam. This is different than, gentrification. We'll talk about gentrification in a minute. I forgot I had this urban renewal slide here. So this is Bilbao, Spain. Before the Olympics, they had a major urban renewal project. You can see here they have this sort of disused rail area and space, and they had a stadium there. And so on. And then urban renewal happens, and they have this park, and they have these roundabouts, and they have these apartment buildings that are, mixed use, and so on. So again, you can see what urban renewal can achieve. It can lead to some very good things. There was a lot of very bad urban renewal too, and I think for the most part it's the bad that people tend to focus on. There was a lot of building of sort of almost Stalinist, brutalist projects. I'm not a fan of brutalist architecture, so I'm not a fan of Munger Hall or the proposed ideas for it. Le Corbusier, who actually, I used to like that type of architecture, I think just to be sort of rebellious because I don't know. Anyway, so that sort of architecture, sort of block-like that you would see in the Soviet Union, that kind of stuff was built in many cities in the United States by the government for poorer people, but then the government didn't maintain those places, and they sort of fell into disrepair and so on. So urban renewal is often followed, but not always, but often followed by something called gentrification. Maybe you've heard of it. This is when you say have urban renewal takes place, and it causes the property values to go up and rents go up, and then that ends up pushing people out who can't afford to live there anymore. So this is as Californians, you're probably familiar with this. If you're from the Bay Area, that's, the most intense gentrification battles in the country are happening there. Los Angeles as well, but especially up in the Bay Area. Then there's a lot of questions here. Sometimes it betters neighborhoods. Like the Tenderloin has far less crime and drug use than it did, say when I went there 20 years ago. It's a lot different. Same with New York City. New York City 20 years ago, 30 years ago, lots of crime. Today, not nearly as much, although it is in both places, it is rising since COVID and all that. But anyway, so gentrification, there's an interesting process that often happens. Often there will be poor, white, but not always white, but artists who will move into an area. It's kind of an industrial area, and because it's cheap and starving artists and whatnot. And pretty soon a gallery will open up. And once there's a gallery, then developers are like, aha, all right, we're going to see people coming here to look at art. They might buy some. They'll have money. So now is the time to build a restaurant. And then a restaurant pops up, and then another one. And then you get, condos and stuff like that. But there's been this process going on since the 60s. And there was someone who said, like, artists are the shock troops of gentrification. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but we have noticed this process kind of repeat itself, at least since the 60s. Okay, so again, as I said, this is a source of huge debate. Urban sociologists don't seem to be using their list forums to fight about this anymore, but yeah, about 10 years ago, there were just vicious online battles between urban sociologists about the pros and cons of gentrification. Basically, it kind of depended on where it was and what was going on. Again, devil and the details. Something to think about. I may throw this question up on Packback. But, do you think gentrification is justified? Or maybe are there ways in which you could clean up neighborhoods and make them still affordable? I talked to people who wanted to design, who had something called affordability by design for Santa Barbara for housing, that they could design houses, and because of the design that they would be affordable. they would be smaller and this sort of thing. But that's not, I found that shockingly naive, just knowing how real estate markets work in Santa Barbara and supply demand, that kind of thing, and all of those affordability by design have basically have become unaffordable. So anyway, it's a big challenge across the country and increasingly across many parts of the world. So Chicago is important for urban planning and urban sociology for a couple of reasons. For one, you have the first modern urban plan, the Plan of Chicago, 1909, trying to figure out, okay, we think we're going to have, another few 100,000 people moving in. Where are we going to put them? That kind of thing. Here's a picture from the first one. It's got a radial design, high system, a trolley system, I believe, that, didn't end up being used because the automobile came about so quickly. It was pretty dictatorial then, no community participation at that time. You also had the early sociologists. So the the sociologists here were different than, say, Marx and Durkheim and Weber, who were, studying big systems like religion and capitalism and monarchy and feudalism and all these things. The urban sociologists in Chicago, and this was the American school, the Chicago school, they basically used Chicago as like a laboratory. Chicago is now the most studied city in the world, has had the most studies written about it because of that reason. They also did the first study of immigration, looking at Polish residents. Interestingly, there are more people of Polish descent in Chicago than in all of Poland outside of Warsaw, the capital there. It's kind of like in Los Angeles, there are more people of Iranian descent than anywhere in Iran outside of Tehran, the capital. So I think that, that's the Tehrangeles, I guess, part of Los Angeles. Ooh, I don't know about you, but this lecture is hurting my throat. Okay. So, urban sprawl, that's the building out, ever outward, of cities, usually subdivisions going outward. This is actually an aerial photo of Santa Maria. That's one of the cities I was looking at in my dissertation. Early book that looked at it that, they're better, more recent recent works, but this one is, was kind of important because it said, basically, the cities aren't necessarily the inner cities. That's not where the action is anymore. It's out on the edges. The suburbs are becoming bigger and more important. And that's been the case for the most part. We have seen in the last, I would say, 20 years, a sort of a resurgence in kind of downtown areas and so on. People wanting to live downtown. So just looking at cities and suburb growth, the blue and gray is looking at 1990 to 2000, and then the sort of purple and green are cities and suburbs from 2000 to 2010. So basically you can see that let's just look at the South. It's been pretty dramatic. You see that basically since the 1990s and into the 2000s, a lot of suburbs, a lot of suburban development in the South, and in the West. A fair amount of city development, but a lot of suburbs again. In the Northeast, really, a little bit of development, but a lot of the Northeast is pretty much built up. There's not a lot of, there's less land available in many places. The Midwest, you actually saw a drop in cities, interestingly. We're also seeing, because of this change, changes in poverty. So, again, poverty used to be something that was concentrated in central parts of the city. Suburbs were where a lot of the wealth was, kind of the second half of the 20th century. That's changed a lot. The suburbs, don't look like that anymore. It's not, it's not simple like inner city and suburbs. Now there are variations within suburbs, older suburbs, newer suburbs. I mean, it's a lot more diverse now. The big change is that, there's a lot of poverty in the suburbs now. In some places, there's actually more poverty in suburbs than in inner city areas because you're seeing more gentrification. Interesting changes there. So like I said, there have been approaches. Smart growth would be like an eco-modernist approach. That's what I say in my book. Therefore, it is fact. So smart growth is, this attempt to try to, build needed development. We need more housing, but in a way that's going to be, not as damaging. And so I interviewed lots of developers and architects, engineers, and city council people, and so on. And it really, I don't think there's any easy answer. I think there's I think every municipality has kind of a different menu depending on what state, and different laws that they have available, and there's a lot of creative things cities can do, and I think that's actually something that that is where I have some optimism, is that there are a lot of creative people who are trying to figure out how do we fix some of these things. So I think that's all good because we are facing big challenges otherwise. We're a consumer-based economy. I mean, we're still humming along post-COVID and with the Russia-Ukraine war. But we've seen how easily things can be destabilized, and climate change, other environmental changes, resource wars, and so on. We could see a lot of destabilization in the years ahead. This is actually a fire in Santa Barbara from about 12 years ago or so. You should all have an emergency bag ready. I think I asked my environmental studies class that, and I think like one or two people rose their hands. I was just, for shame, Anyway, no, I'm serious. You should have stuff ready to go. Having lived probably a bit longer than some of you, I've had to flee at times. And anyway. So are we doomed? I don't know. I'm really inspired by these architects who can build these human houses, but in ways where they are, where cats can live there too, and cats can crawl around and not just have to live in this kind of bland environment set for by humans. One of these houses I think is actually in Santa Barbara, or is featured on some channel or on some show on this cat house in Santa Barbara. Anyway, if the human mind can develop the architecture that makes both cats and humans comfortable, then we should be able to do the same for our planet and the rest of the species. Maybe a little bit ambitious, but we can. That's what we should shoot for. Okay, everyone. Well, I wish you the best of luck on the exam. Like I said, it's open note, open book. It will be open all day tomorrow. Just 20 questions, all definitional. I'll probably be resting my voice all day tomorrow, but we'll be recording my next lecture for Wednesday. All right, everyone. Best of luck on the exam, and have a good week.